pressure to close schools as the Covid-19 pandemic in South Africa gains momentum has been mounting, as South Africa was now in the coronavirus pandemic storm, in the words of President Cyril Ramaphosa.
We accept that a number of teachers have become infected and a number of learners have become infected. And there has been a clear voice and a message that's coming from teacher unions. The Minister of Basic Education is involved with the teacher union organizations, and they are discussing this matter. And I'm hoping that we will have a consensus building type of outcome where we are able to come to a conclusion on what we should do.
On Tuesday, the South African Democratic Teachers Union resolved that schools should close until the Covid-19 peak had passed. On Wednesday, the National Professional Teachers Organisation of South Africa joined the choir of voices demanding that schooling be halted.
The study done presented a picture where indeed the learners in Australia or in Italy were not infecting each other. That is what we were presented with in order to motivate for the reopening of the schools. The South African situation, however, has provided another side of the virus where so many learners have been infected and 7 have lost their lives.
The World Health Organization this week said that reopening schools in any country is only safe in the context of low community transmissions of COVID-19.
We're not the only country that is gone ahead to open schools. A number of other countries have gone ahead to open schools. Now, the World Health Organization, as I was saying earlier, has cautioned that those countries where there's still a rise in infections, it would not be wise to open schools.
And that's where we found ourselves this week on The Story, trying to make sense of what lies ahead for South Africa's fraught education system and the country's school children in the midst of an unpredictable pandemic. I am Rian Grobler, senior journalist at News 24, and this is the 3rd season of The Story.
You're listening to The Story. It's a podcast by News 24. We'll speak to journalists and experts about the week's biggest story. This is what we saw, heard and uncovered this week.
Okay, so we're going to chat to News 24 journalist Sesona Ngakamba, who's been covering the education sector over the last few days. And we start on Tuesday when South Africa's biggest teachers union, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, or known as SATU, resolved that schools should close amid a peak in COVID-19 cases in South Africa. Now, Sesona was there. Sesona, tell us a little bit more about what SATU wants.
Thanks, Rian. Basically, SATU, it was actually a shock for many because they've been quite quiet about the closure of schools and have been monitoring the work being done with regards to ensuring that they are safe for pupils. But on Tuesday, it was rather shocking for many, but also a relief for parents and guardians. And, they resolved during a national executive meeting that, they think schools should close amid the peak of coronavirus infections in the country. And they stated various reasons for that, saying that, one of the reasons was the science evolution. Yes, they acknowledged that, the Department of Education did receive scientific, evidence stating that children were less susceptible to the virus, to contracting the virus. But now they've noted that there've been a lot of cases within the school environment with teachers and pupils, contracting the virus, and they think that it would worsen, especially during a peak. So those are one of the reasons they thought perhaps if schools can just close just until the end of the peak, and then maybe the Department of Education can use the period while schools are closed to prepare so that when everyone returns, so that everyone can return at the same time after the peak.
So, Sesona, fair enough, SATU wants the schools closed until after the peak, but what do they expect to happen while the schools are closed?
Yeah, interesting enough, Rian, during the press conference, someone asked, so why are you not calling for the academic year to be scrapped off? And they said that that would be very difficult to happen because of inequalities within our schooling system. You'd know that, private schools have already even started taking in other pupils in other grades, and they said that it can't be possible for the academic year to be scrapped. But what can be done whilst pupils are at home, especially the matrics that are writing their final exams in preparation for going into varsity next year, there could be radio lessons that are coordinated by both radio stations and cooperating teachers that will be facilitating those, and they call for those to be interactive and instructive. And they also want pupils to be provided with perhaps gadgets so that they can learn via websites that which they say that should be zero rated. So they want more like of a blended learning, online learning system to be in place, so that pupils are not left behind.
SATU's Secretary General Mugwena Maluleke, among other things, said that there were cases where school principals were not telling people about infections at their schools. Was there any evidence presented for this claim?
There was no evidence, Rian, but they did say that they had a feeling that the Department of Education was not, actually adhering to its standard operating procedures, and that is why that school principals were perhaps fearing to talk about cases that they record in schools. Not necessarily that they do have evidence, but they've been hearing it here and there. They don't have tangible evidence to back that up.
All right, Sisona, the education unions are not the only people coming on board with calls for schools to close. We had the former DA leader, Musi Maimane, who has created a petition calling for government, in his own words, not to gamble with children's lives. Tell us a bit more about this petition and what Maimane plans to do.
Yes, indeed, Rian. Musi Maimane, the former DA leader, as would know, he's the leader of One South Africa movement now. And since pupils returned to school on the 8th of June, they've been in court, fighting, saying that, it is irrational that the Department of Education had allowed for school pupils to go back. And, I spoke to Musi Maimane, and he has this petition that's received over 192,000 signatures. And he was saying that, all they're asking the Department of Education to do is really just consider just laying back for a while during the peak. And he says that it's not about him politicking. It's literally about the lives. And he believes that the science is also evolving, which is why he feels strongly. He even told me that he is willing to go to the highest court. We know that the High Court in Pretoria dismissed his application. He's saying that he's willing to go to the highest court, and with this petition that's received over 192,000 signatures, he says that it would hold water for him to actually head to the highest court.
All right, Sisona, but what does the science really say? Schools open on the 8th of June already. It's been more than a month and a week and counting. Are we seeing a huge increase in COVID-19 cases in teachers at our schools?
Yes, we are, Rian. We are seeing an increase in infections at schools. And I think one of the reasons is it's not basically because these cases are coming from the school. It has to do with local, community transmissions. Of course, we know that teachers and pupils belong to communities. And if there's infections within communities, then they spew out into school community. So it is that it's happening outside, but it affects, the schooling system.
So, Sisona, what is your take? When might we expect a decision on this?
The Department of Basic Education usually holds its briefings on Sundays, but my predictions are that we can expect anything between Sunday and Wednesday, next week Wednesday.
All right, that was News 24 journalist Sisona Ngakamba speaking to us there. Thank you, Sisona.
Thanks, Rian.
All right, next we welcome Tsidi Madia, who's a political journalist at News 24. Tsidi, President Cyril Ramaphosa remarked earlier this week that we are now in the pandemic storm, which is characterized by a sharp peak of infections. How does this apply to schools? What were his comments about that?
President Ramaphosa had a lot of interesting remarks. I was listening to him on Wednesday evening, and I kept thinking to myself, when he was hosting in Imbizo, and I kept thinking to myself, he sounds like they're going to close the schools, because he kept referring to the World Health Organization, kept referring to the unions, and the fact that there are parties, numerous stakeholders, who have been saying opening schools is the wrong way to go. We are not seeing a reduction, a decrease in community transmissions. In fact, the country is headed for a peak, and we are seeing numerous schools closing time immemorial because of COVID infections. Teachers are dying, learners are being infected as well. So you could get a sense that he's willing to go back to the table to actually come out and say let's close schools. But he did say that the matter is under discussion, and within coming days there should be some sort of a response. But because our president is that consensus building guy, he wants the response to be, all inclusive and having had everybody's views. So within a few days, I think we will then know what the fate is for the South African schools, and most importantly, the academic year.
The EFF has come out guns blazing, saying this will amount to mass murder. What was the reaction there?
That's also, again, one of those things where I'm saying it's not a surprising view coming from the EFF, because from the minute they knew schools would be reopened, I think the conversation started just before June, they were against it, saying that you are sentencing our children really to murder. You are forcing them to learn with death in the room. How are they meant to focus in an environment of learning when they know that if they pick up COVID, they either themselves could risk death or take it back to their homes where their parents would all die. So the EFF vehemently refusing, saying that even with the digging of the graves, preparing space for those who might die, that's condemning them to death and saying it's the wrong move. Remember, Rian, EFF would rather the country remain at level 5 as this pandemic heads for a peak. So they're definitely against it.
All right. Now, CD, obviously the opening of schools, we're talking about a health issue. We're talking about an education issue. But to what extent has it become a political issue? We know, for example, based on research by Ask Africa, Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga is being considered the least popular of all ministers in the country at the moment. How has this become a political issue for Ramaphosa and the governing party?
I think by and large, with everything around the pandemic, Rian, all is fair in love and war, the minister has become an interesting political football, if you may, because of where she fails. She has been tone deaf, and I think that argument and that criticism is fair because she doesn't seem to have a full comprehension of what she put forward initially. She didn't seem to have an understanding of what she was asking of parents and of schools in the country, and she didn't seem to have a thorough understanding of the state of schools, And so when somebody in that position leads like that, seems tone deaf to the issues, once schools reopen without PPEs, then you get people starting to accuse them of merely chasing tenders, saying that you are pushing for this because you know that there must be tenders that are processed, which means that then you gain and then your patronage network continues to work. You can't dismiss people feeling that way because she doesn't seem to be listening. I fully understand why she's seen as unpopular and why she actually is a liability for Cyril Ramaphosa, because politically speaking, she's one of the people who campaigned for him. So being that kind of character who is responsible for this man's presidency, and then to show so much weakness in guiding and leading schools throughout the pandemic, that speaks to his leadership, So that has been used against him by people even within the ANC and outside the ANC. I always say I don't blame opposition parties when you set yourself up and they take the bait, and they run with it. So I could never blame the EFF or the DA when it comes to their views of Angie Motshekga. And I also think it's problematic that what she puts on the table, she seems so set on holding on to without hearing otherwise. If it wasn't for the World Health Organization, they'd been ignoring other warnings, many other warnings about the issue and going back to the drawing board. It has to be the might of the unions and the World Health Organization that forces this move. So I understand the criticism. And as I was trying to say earlier, in politics, as is in life, all's fair.
And that was CD Madia, News 24's political journalist. Thank you so much for that, CD. And that's it from us this week. I'm Rian Grobler and our producer is Shante Schatz.